Let me tell you something, they didn't tell you the truth. They said if you show up consistently, give your time, your attention, your loyalty, if you stay open, available, understanding, people will respect you. They'll value you. They'll choose you. But reality feels different. The more you give, the less it seems to matter. The more present you are, the easier it becomes to overlook you. And somewhere in that quiet shift, something begins to crack. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to make you question what you believed. There's a reason for that. Human nature doesn't hold on to what is always there. It drifts toward what feels uncertain, what feels like it could disappear. As Epictetus taught, control lies not in what is given freely, but in what is chosen. And when your presence is no longer governed, it loses its weight. But when it becomes deliberate, it begins to mean something again. There's a quiet shift that happens when something becomes constant. It doesn't lose its value, it loses its impact. The mind adapts quickly, faster than most people notice. What once felt rare becomes normal, and what feels normal eventually becomes invisible. Not because it no longer matters, but because it no longer demands attention. Value is not just about what exists, it's about what is felt. And when your presence becomes predictable, it stops being felt in the same way. This doesn't just apply to things, it applies even more to attention, energy, and emotional availability. When something is always accessible, the mind stops registering it as significant. It stops asking questions, it stops leaning in. Certainty replaces curiosity, and over time certainty erases appreciation. That's why effort alone doesn't guarantee recognition. You can give more, show up more, offer more, and still feel overlooked. Not because you lack value, but because your value has become familiar. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "What we do now echoes in eternity." Yet even something meaningful can lose its echo in the present when it is given without awareness. When actions are constant and unmeasured, they blend into routine, and routine rarely captures attention. This is where a subtle truth appears. Value is not just in what you give, but in how it is experienced. And experience is shaped by contrast, by variation, by the presence of absence. At first, consistency feels like strength, and in many ways it is. But consistency without boundaries becomes predictability, and predictability removes tension. Without tension, there is no curiosity. Without curiosity, there is no focus. The mind drifts toward what feels uncertain, what feels incomplete, what feels like it could change. This isn't manipulation, it's simply how attention works. It moves toward what is not fully understood. Think about how quickly patterns form. A message always answered immediately becomes expected. Attention always given becomes assumed. Emotional support always available becomes taken for granted. None of this happens intentionally. It happens gradually, almost invisibly. And by the time it's noticed, the dynamic has already shifted. What once felt appreciated now feels overlooked, and the instinct is to give more to fix it. But giving more in the same pattern only deepens the problem. The mind doesn't measure value by effort. It measures it by contrast. Something that appears and disappears carries more weight than something that is always there. Not because it is better, but because it creates space. And in that space, awareness returns. Without space, everything blends together, no matter how meaningful it once was. Epictetus made this clear in a different way. He who is not a good servant will not be a good master. Control begins internally, not externally. When your presence is given without restraint, it becomes reactive, and anything reactive eventually loses direction. This is where many people lose their influence, not because they lack value, but because they've stopped directing where their energy goes. There's no need for extremes here. No dramatic withdrawal, no forced distance. The shift begins with awareness. Noticing where your presence has become automatic. Noticing where your attention is given without intention. Because once something is given unconsciously, it loses weight. But when it is chosen deliberately, even in small ways, it begins to matter. Again, it's easy to confuse constant presence with importance. But importance is not measured by frequency. It's measured by depth, and depth requires space. Moments where something is not instantly available, not immediately given, not entirely predictable. That's where attention sharpens. That's where perception changes. So the question is not how much you give, it's how it is experienced. Because something can exist in abundance and still feel scarce when it is controlled. And something can exist in abundance and feel invisible when it is not. The difference is not quantity, it's awareness. This is where quiet discipline reshapes everything, not by giving less, but by giving with intention. by allowing your presence to carry meaning instead of just frequency. And over time that shift changes how you are perceived. Not through force, not through explanation, but through something much simpler. What is not constant is noticed. And what is noticed begins to matter again. The change itself is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply alters the rhythm. A slight delay, a calmer response, a moment of silence where there was once immediacy. And the mind notices. It always does, because when a pattern breaks even slightly, attention returns. Patterns allow people to relax around you. They make you predictable, easy to read, easy to understand. But when that pattern shifts even just a little, something changes. The mind starts observing again. It starts paying attention in a way it didn't before. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because something is no longer certain. And that's where everything begins to shift. Not because you try to control the outcome, but because you stop making yourself completely predictable. You stopped being automatic. You became intentional. If this changed the way you see your own presence even slightly, then stay close to ideas that sharpen awareness and refine how you move through the world. Take a moment to subscribe, not out of habit, but as a quiet decision to think more clearly, act more deliberately, and understand what truly holds value. This is where shift begins. Not by removing yourself entirely, but by altering the rhythm. A slight delay where there was once immediacy. A calm response where there was once predictable emotion. A moment of silence where there was once constant engagement. These are small changes, but they carry disproportionate impact, because the mind is highly sensitive to disruption. It notices when something familiar becomes uncertain. It reacts when patterns break, not because the change is dramatic, but because it interrupts expectation. Seneca once wrote, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." But there is another layer to this idea. Attention follows what feels uncertain. When everything is expected, there is no opportunity for attention to grow. It stays flat, predictable, unremarkable. But the moment expectation is interrupted even slightly, the mind shifts. It leans in. It starts observing again. That's not manipulation. It's simply the nature of focus. The mistake most people make is thinking they need to do more to regain attention. More effort, more presence, more explanation, but more of the same pattern only reinforces predictability. And predictability removes curiosity. When nothing changes, nothing stands out. So the real shift is not about adding, it's about adjusting, about creating just enough variation to break the automatic flow. This doesn't mean becoming inconsistent in a chaotic way. It's not about randomness or confusion. It's about controlled unpredictability, a kind of presence that feels steady but not fully readable. Because when someone can't fully predict you, they can't fully relax around you. And when they can't relax, they pay attention. Their mind starts filling in gaps, trying to understand what changed, what it means, what comes next. That mental engagement is what was missing before. There's quiet discipline required here. It's not about reacting differently because of emotion. It's about choosing responses with intention. That difference matters more than it seems. When behavior shifts from reaction to decision, it carries a different energy. It feels grounded, not impulsive. And that grounded presence is harder to ignore because it doesn't follow the same predictable script. Carl Jung once observed, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Patterns operate in that unconscious space. They guide behavior without being questioned. But the moment they are seen, they can be changed. And that change doesn't require force. It requires awareness, noticing where behavior has become automatic, where responses are no longer chosen but expected. As that awareness grows, something subtle begins to shift. You start to notice how small changes created different reactions, how a delayed response draws more attention than an immediate one, how silence can create more curiosity than explanation, how calmness can disrupt expectations more than emotional reactions. These are not tricks. They are reflections of how the mind processes uncertainty. And uncertainty, when used with control, becomes a powerful force. It doesn't need to be exaggerated. It doesn't need to be obvious. In fact, the less visible it is, the stronger its effect. Because the mind doesn't react as strongly to what it understands as it does to what it cannot fully explain. That's where attention deepens. That's where focus returns. There's also a deeper shift happening beneath all of this. It's not just about how others perceive you. It's about how you relate to your own behavior. When you stop acting out of habit and start acting with intention, You reclaim a level of control that was previously unnoticed. Your presence becomes something you direct, not something that simply happens. And that internal shift changes everything externally without needing to force it. The rhythm changes, and with it the dynamic changes, not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. Others begin to adjust, often without realizing why. They respond differently because the pattern they relied on is no longer there. And when the pattern disappears, attention replaces it. That's the quiet power of breaking predictability. Not to confuse, not to manipulate, but to store awareness where it was lost. And once awareness returns, everything feels different. Interactions carry more weight. Presence feels more intentional. Responses feel more considered. Not because anything extreme was done, but because something subtle was changed. The rhythm is no longer automatic, it's deliberate. And that difference, though small on the surface, reshapes how everything is experienced. The moment something changes even slightly, the mind reacts. Not loudly, not always consciously, but it reacts. It begins to search for meaning in the shift, not because anything was clearly stated, but because something was left unsaid. That absence becomes noticeable, and once it's noticed, it creates a quiet tension. Not the kind that feels chaotic, but the kind that pulls attention inward. The kind that makes the mind pause and start asking questions on its own. This is where most people lose their advantage without realizing it. The moment that tension appears, there is an instinct to resolve it, to explain, to clarify, to fill the silence. So nothing is misunderstood. It feels natural, it feels responsible. But in doing that, something important is lost because the tension that was beginning to build, the very thing that creates focus, is removed before it has time to develop. The mind no longer needs to search. It no longer needs to engage. Everything is made clear too quickly. Clarity has its place. But when it is given too early, it removes curiosity. And curiosity is what keeps attention alive. When something is incomplete, the mind doesn't let go of it easily. It returns to it. It replays it. It tries to understand it. That process creates depth. It creates a kind of mental investment that doesn't happen when everything is immediately explained. So the question becomes not how to remove tension, but how to allow it to exist without reacting to it. Epictetus once said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." There is a quiet strength in allowing misunderstanding to exist without rushing to correct it. Not every silence needs to be filled. Not every shift needs to be explained, because the need to explain often comes from discomfort, not necessity. And when actions are driven by discomfort, they lose their grounding. There's something powerful about restraint that often goes unnoticed. It doesn't draw attention to itself, but it changes how everything is perceived. When you don't immediately explain, you create space. And in that space, something begins to form. The other person starts to think. They start to reflect. They start to interpret. And interpretation is far more engaging than being told exactly what to think. The mind doesn't fixate on what is clear. It fixates on what is unresolved. That's why silence can carry more weight than words. Not because silence is inherently powerful, but because it invites thought. It creates a gap, and the mind is wired to fill gaps. It doesn't like uncertainty. So it leans into it, trying to make sense of it. That leaning is where attention grows. But this only works when the silence is real. If the silence is filled with internal anxiety, with waiting, with the need for a reaction, it loses its stability. It becomes fragile, and that fragility can be felt even if nothing is said. True stillness comes from being at ease with the absence of immediate resolution, from not needing to control how something is perceived in every moment. Carl Jung observed, the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. That calm doesn't come from eliminating tension. It comes from learning to sit with it, from recognizing that tension is not always a problem to be solved, but a process to be understood. And when that understanding develops, the urge to react begins to fade. There's also a shift in how silence is viewed. It stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like presence in a different form. A presence that doesn't demand attention but invites it. A presence that doesn't explain but allows meaning to form naturally. And that kind of presence carries a different kind of weight. It doesn't rely on constant reinforcement. It holds itself. As this becomes more natural, the need to control every perception begins to loosen. There's less concern about being misunderstood in the moment and more trust in how things unfold over time, because not everything needs to be clarified immediately. Some things gain clarity through reflection, through distance, through the passage of time. And that clarity tends to be deeper, more stable. There's a quiet discipline in holding that position, in allowing space to remain space, in resisting the urge to step in and fill it. It requires patience, it requires trust, but it also creates a different dynamic, one where attention is not forced but drawn, where focus is not demanded but given freely because something feels unresolved. And that unresolved feeling is not negative. It's what keeps the mind engaged. It's what creates a loop that returns again and again, trying to understand, trying to interpret, trying to make sense of what was not fully explained. That loop is where presence becomes lasting, not because of what was said, but because of what was left open. Over time, this changes how interactions are experienced. There is less urgency, less need to respond immediately, less pressure to clarify everything. And in that reduced urgency, there is more control, more intention, more awareness. Doctors are no longer driven by the need to resolve tension, but by the choice to engage when it feels aligned. And that choice carries weight because it is not automatic. It is deliberate. It reflects a different relationship with silence, with tension, with uncertainty, not as things to avoid, but as elements that shape perception in subtle but powerful ways. So instead of seeing silence as something empty, it begins to feel like something full of possibility, full of interpretation, full of quiet influence. And when that is understood, the instinct to fill it disappears, not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer needed. What remains is a kind of calm presence that doesn't rush, doesn't react, doesn't explain unnecessarily. And in that calm, something shifts. Attention deepens, focus returns, not because anything was forced, but because something was allowed to exist just as it is, unfinished, open, and quietly compelling. There's a subtle difference that most people overlook, and it changed everything. Stepping back is not the same as letting go. Creating distance is not the same as detaching. You can be physically absent and still emotionally present in the strongest way, still tied to outcomes, still waiting, still hoping something shifts. And when that happens, nothing truly changes. The surface may look different, but the dynamic underneath remains exactly the same. Because availability is not just about proximity. It's about where your attention lives, where your emotional energy flows, and whether that energy is still dependent on someone else's response. This is where things become uncomfortable, because it forces a deeper level of honesty. It's easy to delay a response. It's easy to appear distant, but it's much harder to remove the internal pull. The part that keeps checking, keeps wondering, keeps waiting for a reaction. That internal attachment is what people sense, even if nothing is said. It shows in small ways, in timing, in tone, in subtle shifts in behavior. And those small signals reveal more than any deliberate action ever could. The Stoic approach cuts through this completely. It doesn't focus on controlling how others respond. It focuses on controlling what is within reach. Your own reactions, your own impulses, your own attention. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." That strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in restraint, in the ability to pause, in the ability to choose rather than react. And that choice is what separates true distance from performative distance. Because if the mind is still waiting, still seeking, still depending, then nothing has actually been reclaimed. The attention is still external, still tied to someone else's behavior. And as long as that dependency exists, control remains out of reach. It doesn't matter how long the silence lasts or how far the distance extends. Without internal detachment, those actions become fragile. They can break the moment discomfort appears. There's a quiet discipline in redirecting that energy, not suppressing it, not ignoring it, but guiding it, allowing attention to return inward instead of outward. Focusing on what is being built, what is being developed, what is within direct control. This is not about becoming indifferent, it's about becoming grounded. Because when attention is grounded, it no longer shifts based on external reactions. Epictetus expressed this clearly when he said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." That idea moves the need to chase outcomes. It removes the need to monitor reactions. It centers everything on choice. And when choice becomes the foundation, behavior changes naturally. Not as a tactic, but as a reflection of internal stability. This is where most people struggle because it feels unfamiliar. There's a habit of looking outward, of measuring value through response, of adjusting behavior based on feedback. Letting go of that habit creates a kind of emptiness at first. a space where there used to be constant engagement, and that space can feel uncomfortable if it's not understood. But that discomfort is not a sign of loss, it's a sign of transition. As that transition settles, something shifts. The need to check fades, the urge to react softens. The mind becomes quieter, less pulled in different directions, and in that quiet there is clarity. Clarity about what matters, about where energy should go, about what deserves attention and what does not. That clarity creates a different kind of presence, one that is not reactive, not dependent, not easily influenced. And that presence feels different to others. Not because it is forced, but because it is steady. It doesn't fluctuate based on immediate circumstances. It doesn't chase, it doesn't seek validation. It simply exists grounded in its own direction. And that steadiness is difficult to ignore because it breaks the usual pattern of reaction. There's no need to prove anything in that state. No need to demonstrate distance or announce change. The shift is internal first and the external follows naturally. Behavior becomes more deliberate, responses become more measured, silence becomes more comfortable, and all of it happens without needing to explain or justify it. The question then becomes less about how others perceive the change, and more about whether the change is genuine, because genuine change does not rely on outcome. It does not need confirmation. It stands on its own, and when it stands on its own, it becomes stable. It doesn't collapse under pressure or revert when something unexpected happens. This is where real control begins. Not in how others respond, but in how you remain unaffected by that response. Not in creating distance for effect, but in creating space for clarity. And that clarity allows you to move differently, to choose differently, to engage without losing yourself in the process. Over time, this builds a kind of quiet confidence. Not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that doesn't need it. A confidence rooted in knowing that your attention is your own, your energy is directed, your presence is intentional, and from that place, everything changes. Not because you tried to change it, but because you changed what was guiding your actions. So stepping back is not about absence, it's about alignment, it's about making sure that when you move, you're not being pulled but choosing. And that choice, repeated consistently, becomes the foundation of a presence that is no longer dependent, no longer reactive, and no longer easily overlooked. The deepest shift is not about becoming distant from others. It is about becoming closer to yourself. Most people spend years believing that constant availability is the same as love, that endless giving is the same as value, and that always being there will guarantee appreciation. But life reveals a quieter truth. When your presence becomes automatic, people stop experiencing it consciously. Not because you are unimportant, but because the human mind adapts to what is always available. Familiarity dulls awareness. Predictability softens attention. And over time, what once felt meaningful fades into the background of routine. That realization can feel painful at first, because it forces you to confront how much of your energy may have been given without intention. It forces you to notice the moments where you acted from fear instead of clarity, from the need to be understood instead of the confidence to remain grounded. But this awareness is not meant to make you cold or disconnected. It is meant to return you to balance. The true lesson is not to withdraw from the world. It is to stop abandoning yourself within it. There is immense power in becoming deliberate, in choosing when to speak instead of reacting instantly, in allowing silence to exist without rushing to fill it, in stepping back not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as a way of reclaiming your attention. Because attention is your most valuable resource. Wherever it constantly flows, your emotional energy follows. And if that energy is permanently tied to how others respond, then your peace will always remain fragile. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew that strength is not found in controlling people. It is found in mastering your own impulses, in remaining steady when emotions demand immediate reaction, in allowing uncertainty to exist without letting it disturb your center. Real power is quiet. It does not beg for recognition, chase validation, or force itself into every moment. It moves with awareness. It chooses rather than reacts. And once you begin living from that place, something changes naturally. Your presence starts carrying weight again because it is no longer given unconsciously. Your words become more meaningful because they are not excessive. Your silence becomes noticeable because it is calm rather than anxious. Even your energy feels different because it is no longer driven by the fear of losing connection. Instead, it is grounded in self-respect. This is why stepping back is not about becoming emotionally unavailable. It is about removing desperation from your actions. It is about learning that not every message needs an immediate response, not every misunderstanding needs instant clarification, and not every silence needs to be broken. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is remain still and allow life to unfold without interference. That stillness creates clarity. It reveals who values your presence without constant reminders. It reveals where your energy is truly appreciated and where it has simply become expected. Most importantly, it reveals the relationship you have with yourself. Because when you stop constantly reaching outward for reassurance, you begin building something internally that is far more stable than approval from others. You begin building self-command. And self-command changes everything. It changes the way you walk into conversations, the way you respond under pressure, the way you handle tension and uncertainty. Instead of being controlled by every emotional wave, you start observing before acting. Instead of explaining yourself endlessly, you become comfortable letting your actions speak over time. Instead of fearing distance, you learn to use space as a place for reflection and growth. Over time, this creates a presence that feels calm, centered, and difficult to ignore. Not because it is loud, but because it is intentional. People sense when someone is no longer reacting from need. They sense when someone has become internally grounded. That kind of energy naturally commands attention because it is rare in a world driven by constant reaction and endless noise. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: your value was never meant to depend on how often others acknowledge it. Your worth does not increase because someone suddenly notices your absence. It does not decrease because someone failed to appreciate your effort. Your value exists independently of external recognition. The problem is simply that when you forget this truth, you begin giving yourself away unconsciously, hoping others will confirm what you no longer fully believe inside. The solution is not bitterness. It is awareness. Awareness of where your energy goes. Awareness of when your actions are reactive instead of intentional. Awareness of when you are seeking validation instead of acting from alignment. Because once awareness grows, your entire rhythm changes. You stop forcing. You stop chasing. You stop explaining every silence and defending every choice. Instead, you become more selective, more measured, more present in the moments that truly matter. And ironically, that is often when people begin noticing you differently. Not because you try to create attention, but because your presence is no longer scattered. It carries direction, it carries discipline, it carries peace. In the end, the goal is not to become distant from people. The goal is to become deeply connected to your own center so that your actions are guided by clarity rather than emotional dependence. That is where real freedom begins. Not in controlling outcomes, but in controlling yourself. Not in demanding attention, but in becoming someone whose presence naturally holds meaning. And once you reach that place, you no longer fear being overlooked because your sense of value is no longer placed in the hands of others. It rests within you, steady, quiet, and unshaken.